Good afternoon. Let's see. It seemed to have a little shadow here. All right. This afternoon, I'm going to read part 5 of an essay entitled The Spirit of Psychology by C.G. Jung. It appears in Spirit and Nature, papers from the Eranos yearbooks edited by Joseph Campbell, published by Princeton University Press. And this is an 8-part essay. It's about 60 pages long. I've read the first 4 parts before. And so today's task is to read part 5. And so here I go. I will respond to chats at the end of the reading, but during the reading, I'll just keep going. So thank you for joining me. Here we go. The Spirit of Psychology, Part 5, Conscious and Unconscious. This question regarding the nature of the unconscious, just make sure you're hearing me. I guess you are. Okay. This question regarding the nature of the unconscious brings with it the extraordinary intellectual difficulties with which the psychology of the unconscious confronts us. Such difficulties must inevitably arise whenever the mind launches forth boldly into the unknown and invisible. Our philosopher gets about it very cleverly, since by his flat denial of the unconscious, he clears all complications out of his way at one sweep. A similar quandary faced the physicist of the old school, who believed exclusively in the wave theory of light, and was then led to the discovery that there are phenomena which can only be explained by the corpuscular theory. Happily, physics has shown the psychologist that it too can cope with an apparent contradictio in adjecto, whatever that means. Sorry, I didn't look up the Latin. Contradictio in adjecto, A-D-I-E-C-T-O. Encouraged by this example, the psychologist may be emboldened to tackle this controversial problem without having the feeling that he has dropped out of the world of natural science altogether. Before we scrutinize our dilemma more closely, I would like to clarify one aspect of the concept of the unconscious. The unconscious is not simply the unknown, it is rather the unknown psychic. And this we define on the one hand as all those things in us which, if they came to consciousness, would presumably differ in no respect from the known psychic contents, with the addition, on the other hand, of the psychoid system. So defined, the unconscious depicts an extremely fluid state of affairs. Everything of which I know, but of which I am not at the moment thinking, everything of which I was once conscious, but have now forgotten, everything perceived by my senses, but not noted by my conscious mind, everything which involuntarily and without paying attention to it, I feel, think, remember, want, and do. All the future things that are taking shape in me and will sometime come to consciousness, all this is in the content of the unconscious. These contents are all more or less capable, so to speak, of consciousness, or were once conscious and may become conscious again the next moment. Thus far, the unconscious is a fringe of consciousness. As William James puts it, to this marginal phenomenon, which is born of alternating shades of light and darkness, There also belong the Freudian findings we have already noted. We now come to the question of in what state do psychic contents find themselves when not related to the conscious ego? This, this relation constitutes all that can be called consciousness. All right, there's a definition here by William James, in the footnote. So here's how he puts it in the footnote. James speaks also of a transmarginal field of consciousness and identifies it with the subliminal consciousness of F.W.H. Myers, one of the founders of the British Society for Psychical Research, and William James, Frederick Myers' Services to Psychology, Proceedings, concerning the field of consciousness. James says in Varieties of Religious Experience, page 232, the important fact which this field formula commemorates is the indetermination of the margin. Inattentively realized as is the matter which the margin contains, it is nevertheless there and helps both to guide our behavior and to determine the next movement of our attention. It lies around us like a magnetic field, inside of which our center of energy turns like a compass needle as the present phase of consciousness alters into its successor. Our whole past store of memories floats beyond this margin, ready at a touch to come in, and the entire mass of residual powers, impulses, and knowledges that constitute our empirical self stretches continuously beyond it. So vaguely drawn are the outlines between what is actual and what is only potential at any moment of our conscious life that it is always hard to say of certain mental elements, whether we are conscious of them or not. And let me just give you a quick example. I'm about to say a word, and that word is immediately going to bring an image into your mind. As of this moment, you have no idea what word I'm going to use, but once I say it, you will have an image. The word is boat. Now, when I say that word, you could imagine everything from a rowboat or a kayak on up to the Queen Mary, and all of them would be boats, but it just depends on which one comes to your mind first, and I have no idea about that. But that word was unconscious to you, but it was ready to come up and be recalled as soon as I said that word. Okay, so reading on now. In accordance with Occam's razor, principles are not to be multiplied beyond the necessary. The most cautious conclusion would be that except for the relation to the conscious ego, nothing is changed when a content becomes unconscious. For this reason, I reject the view that momentarily unconscious contents are only physiological. The evidence is lacking, and apart from that, the psychology of neurosis provides striking proofs to the contrary. One has only to think of the cases of double personality. Both Genet's and Freud's findings indicate that everything goes on functioning in the unconscious state just as though it were conscious. There is perception, thinking, feeling, volition, and intention, just as though a subject were present. Indeed, there are not a few cases, for example, double personality above mentioned, where a second ego actually appears and vies with the first. Such findings seem to show that the unconscious is in fact a subconscious, But from certain experiences, some of them known even to Freud, it is clear that the state of unconscious contents is not quite the same as the conscious state. For instance, feeling told, feeling toned, feeling toned, I'm sorry. For instance, feeling toned complexes in the unconscious do not change in the same way that they do in consciousness. Although they may be enriched by associations, they are not corrected but are conserved in their original form, as can easily be ascertained from the continuous and uniform effect they have upon the conscious mind. Similarly, similarly, they take on the uninfluenceable and compulsive character of an automatism of which they can be divested only if they are made conscious. This latter procedure is highly regarded as one of the most important therapeutic factors. In the end, such complexes, presumably in proportion to their distance from consciousness, assume by self assume by self amplification an archaic and mythological character, and hence a certain numinosity, as is perfectly clear in schizophrenic dissociations. Numinosity, however, is wholly outside conscious volition, for it transports the subject into the state of rapture, which is a state of will-less surrender. These peculiarities of unconscious state can contrast very strongly with the way complexes behave in the conscious mind. Here they can be corrected. They lose their automatic character and can be essentially transformed. They slough off their mythological envelope, and by entering into the adaptive process going forward in consciousness, they personalize and rationalize themselves to the point where a dialectical discussion becomes possible. Evidently, the unconscious state is different, after all, from the conscious, although at first sight the process continues in the unconscious as though it were conscious. It seems, with increasing dissociation, to sink back to a more primitive, archaic, mythological level, to approximate in character to the underlying instinctual pattern, and to assume the qualities which are the hallmarks of instinct: automatism, non-susceptibility to influence, all or none reaction, and so forth. Using the analogy of the spectrum, we could compare the lowering of unconscious contents to a displacement towards the red end of the color band, a comparison which is especially edifying in that red, the blood color, has always signified emotion and instinct. The unconscious is accordingly a different medium from the conscious. In the near conscious areas, there is not much change because here the alternation of light and shadow is too rapid. But if it but it is just this no man's land which is of the greatest value in supplying the answer to the burning question of whether psyche equals consciousness. It shows us how relative the unconscious state is, so relative indeed that one feels tempted to make use of a concept like the subconscious in order to define the darker parts of the psyche. But consciousness is easily relative. I'm sorry, but consciousness is equally relative, for it embraces not only consciousness as such, but a whole scale of intensities of consciousness. Between I do this and I am conscious of doing this, there is a world of difference amounting sometimes to outright contradiction. Consequently, there is a consciousness in which unconscious predominate. Consequently, there is a consciousness in which unconsciousness predominate. Sorry. Let me. Okay. Consequently, there is a consciousness in which unconsciousness predominates, as well as a consciousness in which self-consciousness predominates. This paradox becomes immediately intangible when we realize that there is no conscious content which can, with absolute certainty, be said to be totally conscious. For that would necessitate an unimaginable totality of consciousness, and that in turn would presuppose an equally unimaginable wholeness and perfection in the human mind. So we come to the paradoxical conclusion that there is no conscious content which is not in some other respect unconscious. Maybe, too, there is no unconscious psychism which is not at the same time conscious. The latter proposition is more difficult to prove than the first, because our ego, which alone could verify such an assertion, is the point of reference for all consciousness and has no such associations with unconscious contents as would enable it to say anything about their nature. So far as the ego is concerned, they are, for all practical purposes, unconscious, which is not to say that they are not conscious to it in another respect. For the ego may know these contents under one aspect, but not know them under another aspect, when they cause disturbances of consciousness. Besides, there are processes with regard to which no relation to the conscious ego can be demonstrated and which yet seem to be represented or quasi-conscious. Finally, there are cases where an unconscious ego and hence a second consciousness are present, as we have already seen, though these are the exceptions. How much further does this have to go? I'm hypnotizing myself. Okay, a little more than a page. Sorry, I'm losing consciousness. Okay, reading on. In the psychic sphere, the compulsive pattern of behavior gives way to variations of behavior, which are conditioned by experience and by volitional acts, that is, by conscious processes. With respect to the psychoid, reflective instinctive state, therefore, the psyche implies a loosening of bonds and a steady recession of mechanical processes in favor of selected modifications. This selective activity takes place partly inside consciousness and partly outside it, i.e., without reference to the conscious ego, and hence unconsciously. In the latter case, the process is quasi-conscious, as if it were represented and conscious. As there are no sufficient grounds for assuming that a second ego exists in every individual, or that everyone suffers from dissociations of personality, we have to discount the idea of a second ego consciousness as a source of voluntary decisions. But since the existence of the highly complex quasi-conscious processes in the unconscious has been shown by the study of psychopathology and dream psychology to be uncommonly probable, we are, for better or worse, driven to the conclusion that although the state of unconscious contents is not identical with that of conscious ones, it is somehow very like it. In these circumstances, there is nothing for it, but but to suppose something midway between the conscious and unconscious state, namely an approximative consciousness. As we have immediate experience only of a reflected state, which is ipso facto conscious and known because it consists essentially in relating ideas or other contents to an ego complex that represents our empirical personality, it follows that any other kind of consciousness, either without an ego or without contents, is virtually unthinkable, but there is no need to frame the question so absolutely. Only a somewhat more primitive human level, ego consciousness, loses much of its meaning, and consciousness is accordingly modified in a characteristic way. Above all, it ceases to be reflected. And when we observe the psychic processes in the higher vertebrates, and particularly in domestic animals, we find phenomena resembling consciousness, which nevertheless do not allow us to conjure the existence of another ego. As we know from distinct experience, the light of consciousness has many degrees of brightness, and the ego complex many gradations of emphasis. On the animal and primitive level, there is mere luminosity, differing hardly at all from the gathering fragrances, differing hardly at all from the glancing fragments of a dissociated ego. I'll read that sentence again because I kind of lost it in the middle of it. On the animal and primitive level, there is a mere luminosity, differing hardly at all from the glancing fragments of a dissociated ego. Here, as on the infantile level, consciousness is not a unity, being as yet uncentered by a firmly knit ego complex, and just flickering into life here and there, wherever outer and inner events, instincts, and effects appear to call it awake. At this stage, it is still like a chain of islands or an archipelago, nor is it a fully integrated whole, even at the higher and highest stages. Therefore, it is capable of indefinite expansion. Gleaming islands, and indeed whole continents, can still add something to our modern consciousness, a phenomenon that has become the dignity, a phenomenon that, okay, here we go. I'm going to go back a couple sentences. At this stage, it is still like a chain of islands or an archipelago, nor is it a fully integrated whole, even at the higher and highest stages. Rather, it is capable of an indefinite expansion. Gleaming islands and indeed whole continents can still add themselves to our modern consciousness, a phenomenon that has become the daily experience of the psychotherapist. Therefore, we would do well to think of ego consciousness as being surrounded by a multitude of little luminosities. Okay, I made it. That is today's reading. As you know, if you've been following these readings, reading Dr. Jung's work is sometimes hypnotizing to me. I think it's partially because I'm a 99th percentile intuitive, which means that I get everything. I can see the big picture, very well. And so everything he says puts me out into some other part of hyperspace. And so trying to keep myself in so I can simply read a page um, is sometimes very challenging. And so that's why I'm keeping these readings to a few pages. Uh, Ben Tahoe says, "This is amazing. You're doing a great job. It's really complex and difficult. Reminds me of a part I looked at from Analysis of Mind by Russell." Yep. And, obviously, um, these articles and all of Jung, you can't just get it from a reading. You have to, um, or from an audible version. You really have to look at the books and study them, and then you can grok it or listen to these readings over and over again, and then slowly it starts to dawn on you. Um, I know there's a couple of lectures by Edward Edinger that I've probably listened to 20 or 25 times. And I started to understand them about time 10, but and I was intrigued by them by the first time, but they have so much meat in them that you really have to think it through and try to understand what's being said. So I'm going to conclude my reading for today. I have another check-in that I have to be involved in this afternoon that involves several psychotherapists. And just for an announcement, Tim Holmes and I have decided to offer another instance of um, coronavirus check-in. We're trying to offer a place where people can balance their psyche against a time that's possibly going to be a global epidemic of depression and anxiety. And so we think that we can supplement the work of mental health professionals. Not everyone can get to them. So we're laymen, but we are informed laymen. So we can try to help the psyche of the world, and in so doing, provide an example for others so that you can create a similar activity in your field. Um, so we're currently, mainly for the U.S. during the daytime, we are doing global check-ins at 11 a.m. on Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday. And you can find those on the homepage of this YouTube channel and pick any one of them, and you will find the links to get to the next one. There are 3 different links depending on what day of the week it is. And then we just, before I came on this reading, we just decided to do a check-in for that is timed to support um, Australia and New Zealand and Southeast Asia, Japan, and Korea. And so that will be conducted at 11 a.m. I'm sorry, I beg your pardon. That the Australia check-in will be conducted at 10 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time on Saturday night. I'll be setting that up in the next few hours. And so that means it's 8 p.m. for Tim, who lives in the Mountain Time Zone. For Australians, it turns out to be 1 in the afternoon if on Sunday, because the Australians are ahead of us by 15 hours. So for Australia, it's 1 in the afternoon, Sydney time, and 10 a.m. Perth time. And this will be on your time zone Sunday. For Americans, it will be in the American time zones from 10 p.m. Saturday, U.S. Eastern Time, or 7 p.m. Saturday, U.S. Pacific Time, and what is it, 4 p.m. Hawaii time. And it also works out to be 10 a.m. in Singapore and Kuala Lumpur, and it's 10 a.m. on Sunday, that is, and 11 a.m. in Japan time. So we hope that we will have some followers who will be able to check in from those countries at that time zone. And so anyway, I look forward to seeing you at one of our check-ins. You can take a look at them. We've recorded them, so they're all on this YouTube channel. So far, we've only done 2. The next one will be the Australian one, which is going to be Saturday night, starting at 10 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time, and 1 p.m. Sunday, Sydney time. And then the next one after that will be Sunday morning at 11 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. So Ben says, I'm an English major. My favorite dudes are Montaigne, Santayana. Mainly also, I really enjoy Aurelius, Seneca, Zhuangzi, Wang Yangming, and Eduardo Galeno. Okay, so now you're going to have to get into Carl Jung once you fall into the abyss of Jungian thought. The rest of them will all fall by the wayside, but that's what I think about Jung's work. But anyway, so thank you for being here today, Ben, and I'll see you soon. I'll be reading. Let's see, Saturday. I'll be doing a reading tomorrow at 4:30 p.m. and then I will be doing the Australia check-in at 10 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time tomorrow night. That works out to be 1 p.m. Sunday Sydney time and 10 a.m. Sunday Perth time, just for everybody's information. So Ben says he didn't know which of his works to read. Ben, let me see if I can very quickly get you the link that will help you with that. I did a, right, I have it here. I did about a 30-minute lecture on this 4 years ago, which is still relevant. And here's the link. This is the link for lecture 3. And it's how to get started with the work of C.G. Jung. So you can give that a listen, and that will give you a sense of how to get started. I'm not going to redo it here because it's just too time consuming. Lewis Williams says, what do you know about the wizard magician archetype? Well, as Olivia Newton-John once sang, you have to believe we're magic. And so I know lots about it. And there are more than 1,000 videos on this YouTube channel. So you can have fun finding the ones that address it specifically. You might want to listen. There's a playlist called Learning the Tarot. I did 18 videos on how to read the tarot cards. And a lot of people think that tarot is wooey woo, but it's not. It's simply a method of sort of creating synchronicity. It forces synchronicity, and so I did 18 videos to teach you how to read the tarot cards. So that's a magical thing. And if you watch those 18 videos, perhaps 2 or 3 times, then you can be an ace tarot reader, just for openers. Of course, there are other people who do other forms of divination. They all rely on the basic, to include astrology and reading tea leaves and checking the clouds, whatever it is. But what they all do is that they activate hooks in the unconscious of the person you're reading for, and cause them to think about things in different ways. So if I were to do a tarot reading, and I referred to the term mother, everybody's got a mother. And so it may be that you have something good going on or something bad going on with your mother, either way. And when I say that word mother, then that makes you think about that situation and try to put it into context of the reading. So that's sort of a simplistic way to do it. But I mean, there's nothing particularly magical per se about it. I mean, a lot of people have held themselves out as magic for thousands of years, of course, and older ladies will put on a turban and a certain kind of dress, and they'll do a reading, or they'll do a reading with a crystal ball or something like that. But there's nothing magic there. There's only I can say anything, and it will cause you to start making associations with your life. So just as in this conversation right now, when I'm talking about something, every word that I use, for example, earlier I wanted to show you about words that are subliminal, but everybody has a concept about it. And so I said the word boat. And so everybody's got a picture of a boat first thing up in their mind. But if I talk about a rowboat, a power boat, a sailboat, a yacht, a ocean liner, we all have pictures of all those things too. And none of you were thinking about those things until I just said them. So that's the way divination works. And so it's the way a conversation works too. It's the way we deal with things that are bothering us in our unconscious, whether we chat with friends at a tailgate party at an NFL game, or whether we are having tea or coffee at Starbucks with someone, or chatting with someone over the back fence, as we kind of are here. It gets your unconscious mind working and gets you to work out your issues. And that works, most of the time, that works pretty well for everyone. But some people do get stuck, and that's when psychotherapists come in. Lewis says, I favor a cartoon called Yu-Gi-Oh, which is based on tarot cards. Yep, suggestibility, absolutely. So I have often said that I could go into an auditorium with 1,000 people in the auditorium. I could take the cards and simply throw them across the stage, and without putting them in any special layout, I could just walk across the stage and read the cards. And everyone in the auditorium would think I did a reading for them, and everyone would hear a different reading. And the reason for that is because everybody's got different issues going on about their mother, about their sister, about a love interest, whatever it is. And so everybody's mind gets cooking in a different way, and that's the way it works. So yes, I do know something about magic and prophecy, and there's the next section of this essay that I'm going to read is addressing that in part also. So anyway, I'm going to move on for the rest of my day, and I will see you tomorrow at 4:30. Have a nice evening on Friday night. I guess we'll be all at home watching television. Peace.